In 2010, I was hired by a group of Dutch companies to represent them in a war crimes investigation which was launched against them in the Netherlands. The war crime committed by that group of Dutch companies was that they had rented out equipment through an Israeli subsidiary to Israeli construction companies, who in turn had used that construction equipment, cranes and hydraulic platforms, in the West Bank to construct the security fence and to build in settlements. So the Dutch government decided that the Dutch company had aided and abetted the perpetration of a war crime because it had rented out equipment like Avis, Hertz, and other companies to Israeli construction companies. And they viewed this as the biggest war crime case in the history of the Netherlands since Nazi Germany occupied the Netherlands. And they pursued this case with utmost conviction. In defending the case, I decided to hire expert international law professors to help me on the case. And I approached a leading European expert, because the Dutch take the Europeans more seriously than they do an Israeli expert. And he said he'd love to take the case. It's a huge case, of course. And when I sent him the summary of the arguments we will need to make, suddenly he called me up and said, Daniel, I'm sorry, I disagree with many of the arguments, so I'm sorry, I can't help you on the case. Now, I was really concerned because these were the arguments we're going to raise in court, right? So I call him up, and he tries to avoid the call. And after a lengthy negotiation, he agrees to have a long call to discuss why he won't take the case. And we go point by point, and he agrees with every point I make. So we conclude the discussion. I say to him, why won't you work with me on this case? And he says to me, Daniel, you need to understand, if I work on this case, I will never work in Europe again. So today, one of the problems we face, in addition to the fact that we're fighting for our name and fighting to clear the fact that we're not committing war crimes, apartheid, etc., many of the people who know we are right are unwilling to publicly proclaim that we are right for fear of them being harmed. And in academia, this has become almost a plague. And so I'm very pleased to introduce Eugene Kontorovich, who is today, as I said, one of the more outspoken international academics, focusing on our Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Arab conflict, who has never been afraid to write what he understands to be the more accurate descriptions of what the law says and what the legal result should be. And Eugene will tell us a bit in 8 minutes about where should we go from here.
Thank you. If diplomacy is the extension of war by other means, in today's world, law and international law is the extension of diplomacy by other means. Things can be put in a legal context that sound more powerful and more compelling than claims which, if made diplomatically, would sound undiplomatic. So, for example, the legal claim Israeli settlements in the West Bank violate international law sounds better than the diplomatic claim that Jews, for example, Jews should not live in the old city of Jerusalem. That sounds arbitrary and non-diplomatic. Put in legal terms, it sounds like a general rule. It's not about Jews. It's not about the old city. It applies everywhere. When we learn, however, that the international community reacts very differently to an American Jew who purchases a property in the old city than to the very large number of, say, British nationals who purchase properties in Turkish-occupied northern Cyprus, we see that these aren't legal claims. That is to say, the nature of a legal claim is a general rule applicable similarly to similar cases, but rather diplomatic claims in legal guise. As Minister Kotler described, there are indeed many challenges on the legal front, but there's also good news. Israel is surprisingly well positioned to respond in the legal arena, and doing so in an offensive and proactive way, and that may be what is most needed. So not responding, as we are currently doing, to the constant barrage of initiatives. We're responding in the ICC, we're responding in national courts, and it's the opponents of Israel who have the initiative. who are setting the agenda, who are picking the battlegrounds, who are picking the timing of the fights. And strategically, it's never good to be on the defensive. It's always good to be setting the initiative oneself. And I'll give you a case study of an example where this has recently been done to significant success. And it shows the advantages, I think, of the initiative, the advantages of being proactive, the advantages of venturing rather than responding. And this will suggest tools that can be used against the much more dangerous European campaign of differentiation, the campaign which the European Union describes as a campaign to differentiate the West Bank and the Golan Heights from Israel, but is in fact a campaign to differentiate the legal treatment of Israel from Europe's legal treatment of any other country. So in the past year, there has been a rather remarkable development in the United States. 9 states have passed laws restricting government dealing, either pension investments or contracting or both, with companies that boycott Israel. 9 states, and New Jersey is scheduled to vote today, in a few hours, to send a bill to the governor which would make it the 10th state in 1 year. In almost all cases, these laws apply to companies that boycott Israel or territories under its jurisdiction. And at a time when we are told that Israel is a divisive issue in America, that it's pulling the parties apart, we find that these laws are passing by overwhelming bipartisan majorities. And indeed, Israel and the protection of boycotts against Israel is something that can actually bring people together on a state level. And now that this is out there, states across the country, state houses across the country want this. I've been quite involved in these efforts. And we see that it completely changes the dynamic. Because now, this is something that's happening. It's something that's being done. And it puts critics of Israel in a position where they need to respond. And they are responding. They make arguments. We have counter-arguments to their arguments. But the focus now is on them, not on Israel. And indeed, these state laws also demonstrate how important it is to use the law to establish a narrative, as I think the legislators in these states are trying to do. These legislators, first of all, see the boycotts of Israel as a form of discrimination against Jews. And they don't see that discrimination as being any better or different depending on what side of a 1949 armistice line it occurs on. That's why these laws apply to territories and to West Jerusalem as well. And this also is a fundamental counterpoint to the European efforts of so-called differentiation. The European effort is to create a no-go zone, a zone of death, a pariah leprous state for all activity conducted under the auspices of the Israeli government across the 1949 armistice lines and in the Golan Heights. And when you look at the laws that are being passed by the United States, they say, we refuse to accept that as something that's required by international law. But we don't just need the laws of the states to show that this principle is rejected. I'll tell you something amazing. Even as the Human Rights Commission is making a list of businesses who supposedly, quote-unquote, profit from the occupation, just in the past year, there's been an amazing decision by no one less than the European Court of Justice, which quite clearly held that international law does not prohibit companies from doing business in occupied territory, even occupied territories where there's horrible human rights abuses. Now, of course, the European Union has also at the same time adopted a position that a country that occupies territory is not required to differentiate in its labeling between its territory and the territory it occupies. Now, those precedents of the European Union, the European Commission, and the European Court of Justice, of course, concern Moroccan-occupied Western Sahara. But if it's international law we're talking about, and supposedly that is what we're talking about, the rules that play out in Western Sahara are the same rules that need to play out in the West Bank. Israel has an extraordinary opportunity now to force the European Commission to internalize its inherent contradictions. They've been creating one legal universe for their dealings with all the other countries of the world, and a separate universe for Israel. Israel needs to break through the walls of that legal ghetto, and I think the prospects are quite good. One would be surprised to learn that in every recent court decision, there have been several recent European court decisions about companies' activities in the West Bank. In these cases, in the UK Supreme Court, in important appeals courts in France, the anti-Israel position has been defeated every time. The European courts have found doing business with Israel in Jerusalem, in Mitzpeh Sholem, isn't a war crime, and that the European narrative to the contrary seems to have little legal persuasive value to unbiased, non-UN related bodies. And so the situation is actually quite positive, but what it takes is initiative. And there are some things that are best done by private actors. There are some things that require the initiative of American legislators, passing legislation in the United States. That's the idea of American representatives, the representatives of the people in America. Other things, like taking on the European Commission's labeling policy, requires something only states can do. The ability to protest on a state level, the ability to protest in the World Trade Organization, and those things require state activity, and that's what we have a state for, to engage in those activities.